Hey everybody. Okay, so I was posting a live video and somebody came on and said, "Looks like you're on mute, but I think I'm okay." I'm gonna restart anyways. Alright. So bear with me here. I'm gonna try to delete the other ones. Okay. Okay, objective versus subjective. This is a concept that I like to come back to quite a bit because first of all, I think it's very important to understand the difference between, the judging functions, thinking and feeling, and what exactly they're doing and what they're not doing. And it's a very big source of confusion because people use the words objective and subjective differently. And I fully admit that I use it very differently than the way Jung used it. Now, the way that I use it, subjective and objective, is the way that you use it in normal everyday language. Objective being, the third party will agree that what you're saying is true, as long as they're following the same logical process and as long as all the premises are true, they're going to come to the same conclusion that you do. So think of math, right? 2 + 2 = 4, so on and so forth. All the mathematical formulas. Nobody's going to come in. I mean, even though there's these weird social science arguments about 2 + 2 = 5, ignore those for a second. But in the real world, nobody's going to come in and argue against you that 2 + 2 = 4. And that it's an objective truth and that you're going through a valid and logical process and coming up to with a logical conclusion. Okay. To me, that's what objective means. I'll get into what Jung was talking about in a minute. But subjective is going to be um, conclusions that we make that aren't necessarily true, right? That are based off of our opinions, or things that just you might not be able to logically prove, but it's just sort of a consensus, like what's the best hamburger, right? Or what's the best way to make a hamburger, that kind of thing. And so subjective is going to be more FI, right? It's going to be more about your personal opinion, your value. Do you see something as valuable versus not valuable? At a very large scale, it's going to be things like ethics, your overall, your ethical principles, ethical arguments, things like that. Things that should be, not necessarily things that should be or ought to be, as opposed to things that are, right? Um, okay. Um, so Jung, and why this gets confusing. So Jung had a very you different thing in mind when he was using the terms objective and subjective. And you have to keep in mind that Jung had um, this big distinction on the real world, the physical world, the world that's out there that we all share, versus your subjective mind, right? Your subjective world. Um, and he saw, the real world has all the objects and the furniture and, everything out there that if somebody walks in the room, they see it just the way that you see it, right? Now, of course, there's all kinds of philosophical questions of, is their blue the same blue to you it is to them, all that kind of stuff. Don't worry about any of that. But at least, like, when they see that there's a couch in the room, they see that there's a table in the room. And assuming that, they could see and, have a fully functional visual system, they see the same thing. Okay. Um, and so to him, that's sort of the objective world, right? The world of the object, things out there, outside of your mind. But he also sort of famously thought that your subjective world is just as real as the world outside, right? You've got these ideas and concepts and symbols and all that kind of good stuff, fluttering around in your mind world. And And that is subjective, right? Like somebody can't walk in the room and see what's going in your mind. Now you can articulate what what you're thinking, and try to describe it as best you can, but they're not going to experience it in the same way that they experience the real world, with all the couches and tables and everything. And Jung has this phrase, I'm going to paraphrase it, the saying that, that the objects in the mind are just as real as the furniture outside in the world. That he believed that your ideas and concepts and things like that inside your mind were just as real. It's just that only you, for the most part, see them. Now, of course, there's this collective unconscious where maybe there's this sort of non-physical, metaphysical world that we all can tap into, and share, but we'll keep that aside for a second. But at least, outside in your conscious mind, you have these things bouncing around, these ideas, concepts, whatever representations. And in Jung's argument was like, those things are just as real. You can manipulate those things just like you can pick up objects in the world. Okay. But only you have access to them. Nobody else has access to them. And so that's what makes them subjective. Okay. So when Jung was talking about TI versus TE, he was talking about it very differently than the way that I think about it and the way that I talk about it. Okay. Now, of course, he's, this is not me trying to say I outsmarted Jung or anything. It's just to say that we're talking about them in sort of different ways. Okay. When he talked about TI, he was talking about, let's start with TE. That's the easier one for me. When he's talking about TE, he's talking about somebody who's sort of thinking about the external world, and especially, in Jung's mind, like to an unhealthy degree, like they're too focused on it. They're a lead extroverted thinker a lot of times. And so they're worried about building things and making things and having and manipulating things and creating things in the outside world, in this objective world where everybody could see and everybody shares. Where the TI user is more focused on all the ideas and the stuff sort of living inside their own little personal world, their mind world, and aren't as obsessed with what's going on out there as they are in here. And that's where, that sort of jibes with our normal view of an introvert versus extrovert, right? An extrovert's out there, they're doing stuff, they're making things happen. Where the introvert is just sort of quietly sitting there and reading or letting, just sort of exploring the inner contents of their own mind, right? And that is sort of the classic distinction between the extrovert and introvert, right? Or the extroverted thinker or the introverted thinker. Are they living in their own mind, or are they living out in the world? Are they living in the world of objects, or are they living in the world of ideas or subjective things? Okay. Now, that leads to a lot of confusion when people are trying to think of, am I an extroverted thinker or am I an introverted thinker? Because they start thinking of, they start conflating the idea of objectivity, where Jung, again, was just talking about physical world versus inner world, object-oriented versus subject-oriented. He, as far as I know, wasn't using the word objective to mean we all universally agree upon it, right? It's a logical, sound, valid conclusion. That's not what he meant when he was talking about objectivity. But it is what I mean. When I use the word objective or subjective, I'm using it in the real world sense, and outside of the way Jung was using it. I'm using it in the way that everyday people use objective versus subjective. Where is it universally true? Will we all agree to it as long as we all agree on the first principles and um, all the principles are true and we're following the same logical steps, are we going to come to the same objective conclusion? Is it necessarily true? That's objective reasoning to me. And that is TI. Okay. To me and others, but maybe not everybody. But to me, TI is doing the logical processing. It's checking whether or not something is valid. It's coming up with the valid conclusion that as long as the input going into it is true, and as long as you're following correct rules of logic and doing the process right, you are going to come up with the correct answer. You are going to come up with an answer that cannot be proven wrong, right? Now, again, that's a lot of times very hard to do because there's a lot of big ifs there, right? Number one, the information you're feeding into it has to be true. And number two, you have to be able to do the logical processing in the right way. And that's a big if. And then number three, you can come to a conclusion and you have to be able to explain what that conclusion is. And so 2 + 2 = 4. It's very easy. We all understand what 2 is. We all understand what plus is. We all understand what equals is. We all understand what 4 is. There's not really a whole lot of debate there. Again, not taking into account the crazy stuff about 2 + 2 = 5. That's for another video. They're trying to say there is no TI, it's all FI, but in their own little academic way. Okay, and so the logical processing is things like transitive inference. A is bigger than B, B is bigger than C, so therefore A is bigger than C, right? By transitive inference, it's the valid, necessary, logical conclusion, okay? That's TI. That's what TI is trying to do, okay? TE, on the other hand, is trying to figure out an ordinal steps to a process. It's trying to figure out a routine or a route. How do I get from point A to point B to point C to point D? That's the kind of thinking that it's doing outside in the world. Like I need to drive to work. I need to go from my house to the office, my office. Now, there are a lot of different routes that I could take, a lot of different streets, a lot of different highways, a lot of different alleys. I could probably come up with an infinite number of routes that I could take. Some are obviously going to be very inefficient and not worth it, right? It doesn't make sense for me to drive out to the airport, take a plane to Shanghai, stay, drive around Shanghai for a little bit, then take a plane to France, and then take a plane back to where I live, and then drive from the airport to my office. Like that is a route. That is a TE solution that will work, but nobody in their right mind would do it, right? But let's focus on what would be reasonable, right? I could take this street up to that highway and then take this exit and then get off on this street, take a right here, go down that street, blah, 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 presto, changeo, I'm at the office. Now, somebody else could come up and say, no. What you want to do is you want to take this street and then go to that highway and then take that exit and then take this street and then take this back street and then do this. And you're going to save yourself 15 minutes. Okay, great. But it's, going through a bad part of town, or, I like the scenery, my way, or there's less traffic and I just hate traffic. So I'm going to take my route, and they might argue that their route is the correct one because it saves you 15 minutes. And they're basing their idea of correctness off of, is it faster? But it's not necessarily correct. It's not necessarily the only way to go. It might be the fastest way, or it might, save you the most money on gas or whatever, but it doesn't mean correct in the sense of valid and objectively true. Okay. Now, what they're really doing when they're telling you you're doing it wrong is they're using their FI, right? They have an opinion that saving time is valuable, or saving money is valuable, or whatever. And to them and their FI machine, they're saying this is the best way, or this is the quote unquote correct way of going, because it's in their head the most efficient, saves most money, saves the most time. But in your head, you might think, well, I don't really care about the 15 minutes that I'm going to save. I'd rather have a more pleasant drive. I'd rather leave 15 minutes earlier or whatever to have a more pleasant drive, or not have to drive through a dangerous area of town, or not have to get on that highway because I hate that highway and it's so hard, to get off on that exit or whatever, right? You might have your own FI reasons for not wanting to do their TE route, but both TE solutions are correct, right? They get you from the point A to point B, but maybe in different ways, and they're sort of these FI value-based trade-offs, right? But you can't say that either one of those routes is objectively true, okay? The only thing you could say is, well, I've got this criteria, and the most important criteria to me is saving gas or saving time, and this saves me the most gas, or this saves me the most time. Okay, fine. Then go with that. But it doesn't mean it's necessarily the only solution to this TE problem, right? And so that's why I would say TE is more of a subjective process, right? And so obviously this is very counter to what Jung would say. It's very counter to what 95% of the people in doing psychological types and all that cognitive functions are going to tell you, because they're so hung up on TE is finding statistics and measures and finding the most efficient way and blah blah blah. Yeah, it's doing that because it's trying to solve a problem, it's trying to solve a process, and it might be using data like statistics or measurements, or how much time am I going to save, how much fuel am I going to save, and it's inputting that into the subroutines that's trying to figure out the overall TE routine. But it doesn't mean it's necessarily true in the real sense of objective versus subjective, right? Okay, so let's see here. Sorry, messing with my channel here. Okay, so figuring out the TI versus TE. So the TI users are going to be the ones who are correcting you on precision all the time, right? Are you using the right word? Are you using the right grammar? Is the word that you use really mean what you're saying, or is it, even though it's close enough, it's not really the right word that you're looking for? Or are you saying 15 items or less when it's really 15 items or fewer? Is your grammar correct? I use this example all the time. My sister's an INTP, like supercharged INTP. And my whole life, she's just, whatever you say, she's going to correct it. She's going to give you some sort of correction to, and again, it's not about process, and it's more about just like you said the wrong thing and she's going to correct you. So for example, somebody asked me, hey, how do I get to the gas station from here? And I say, oh, it's about 5 blocks down the street. And then an INTP or a lead TI user, ENTPs, those types, they're going to chime in and be like, oh no, it's 6 blocks down the street or 7 blocks down the street, as if the person's going to drive 5 blocks and then stop and be like, oh, well, there's no gas station. So it's this precision that they're focused on, where those of us who, we're front stack TI, like an INFJ, we're going to try to be as precise as possible, but we're not going to like overdo it like the INTPs or the ENTPs might do. And they get obsessed with definitions, right? Because they're plugging and chugging things into their logic system. And if we're plugging and chugging different packets of information into the logic processor, then we're going to come up with different conclusions. So your defined terms, like what do you mean by objective? What do you mean by subjective? What do you mean by thinking? What do you mean by feeling? That is all going to be very important, because you can't determine whether somebody is correct or not unless we're all agreeing on what we're putting into our correctness machine, right? If I say thinking means one thing and you're saying thinking means something else, and we're trying to come up with a distinction between an INTJ and an INFJ, if we don't agree on what it means to be an introverted thinker or what it means to be an extroverted thinker, then we're not going to come up with a meaningful distinction between INFJ and INTJ, right? We can't agree on the fundamentals going into the problem, right? Or if I don't agree with what two mean, if we're trying to figure out 2 + 2, what does that equal? And we disagree on what two means or what plus means or what equal means, then again, we're not going to come to the same conclusion. And so INTPs, ENTPs, to the extent INFJs, ISFJs, we're going to get bogged down on the definition game, when we're trying to not necessarily argue with somebody, but trying to make a judgment, trying to come to a conclusion, because we want to make sure that we agree on what's going into the input. TE users don't get obsessed with that kind of stuff. Now, they get obsessed with my way is the correct way, because they have that FI that's sort of pulling the strings and telling them, oh, you're so good. Your TE skills are so great. You definitely nailed it and found the best possible way, right? And so the FI is going to come up with that criteria. Like, what do I think is important? Is saving gas important? Is saving time important? Is having a pleasant trip important? Is safety important? Is avoiding that highway important? That's all FI stuff, right? And so when they're coming up with their TE solution, they're going to be using that FI to sort of calculate, okay, I don't like this solution because it doesn't save enough gas or it doesn't save enough time, right? It's and those are my important criteria. Okay, so but the TI users are, like, I'm the type of person, like, I take various ways to the office because I just hate routine. So someday I'll take this street, sometimes I'll take this street, sometimes I'll take this highway, other times I'll take another highway, I'll take this exit, that exit. I know I'm going to get there eventually, and I'd rather just have the variety in my life and try different things than doing the same thing every day, because that would drive me crazy. But a TE user, that's probably going to drive them crazy because I'm not taking into account, like, am I saving time? Am I saving gas? It's like, as long as I get there, like, where I'm going and like close enough on time, I'm good. Where a TE user, that might just like drive them absolutely batty because they figured out the best way to do it and they're just going to keep doing it that way. Okay, until they find a way that's even better, then that's great. Okay, so all this was motivated by another video. It's the typing video on talking with famous people, and there's this interaction with me and another user, and we sort of came to different conclusions about what type we think this person is, I think. And I was making the comment that this person seems to be more of a FI-TE type, like more of like an ENFP. And mainly because they would say things like, everybody has their own truth, and I just happen to think mine's better than everybody's, or I'll listen to other people's opinions, but ultimately, I do what I want to do, and not really focusing on, is it correct? Is it true? Is it universally true? But more of the sort of FI, I'm going to weigh it out and see what I think kind of thing. Eric ended up typing him differently than I would have come out, but that's fine. Maybe he saw something different than I did. But the motivation was this sort of interaction with the other user, because again, I think they were thinking, when I was saying, he seems to be more of a subjective FI type, um, I don't want to say thinker, but he's using more FI decision making, um, because it's very subjective. I think there's a disconnect with this other user that, well, isn't TI subjective? And this is my case for, why I don't think TI is quote unquote subjective in the way that I'm thinking about it. And I think the other user was thinking about it in the way that Jung, and then like 95% of the cognitive function, psychological type community thinks of TI as it's the thinking that's going on inside your head, as opposed to relying on outside data. You're relying on your own data. And I think, fine, I get it. But I think that leads to a lot of confusion. I think when people are trying to figure out, am I a TE user, a TI user? I think it's much easier to think of, are you a process person? Are you a process junkie? Or are you obsessed with logical validation? Do things have to be logically validly true for you? Or are you more, or do you care more about the process? Like, what's more efficient versus, having to be absolutely correct and validly true. Now, it gets a little fuzzy because the ENTJs and the ESTJs, especially the extroverted thinkers, they come across as being like, they figured out a solution to a problem, a process, a way that they want things done, a way that they've always done it. And to them, they are going to say that is the correct way of doing it. Okay. Now, when they say correct, they're not using the word correct in the same way that I'm using correct. Again, it's this TI focus on definitions. When they say correct, they're thinking, I have all these FI variables that I want to achieve. I want it to be the cheapest. I want it to be the fastest. I want it to be, the least distracting, the quietest, whatever, right? They've got this list of criteria that they want to achieve. And this process achieves those goals the best, that they've decided, right? So at work, we've got this process, and we do it this way. Why do we do it this way? Because A, everybody understands, it's just easy to follow. B, out of things that everybody understands, this is the fastest. C, it's the cheapest. D, it takes the fewest resources. E, one person can do it as opposed to two people, whatever. They've got their criteria, and then they've come up with their TE solution. And they are going to tell you, and they are going to go to their grave telling you that that is the correct way of doing it. Now, it might be the most efficient. It might be the best. It might be the most optimal, but it's not the correct. Correct means validly true. It's like the only way you could do it. Now, there could be situations where, like, there's a process and it literally is the only way you could do it. It's the way the computer program's set up, and you got to do it this way, and you can't do it any other way. Now, in that respect, I would agree. Okay, that's the correct way to do it because it's the only way. It's the valid, conclusion that is objectively true. But if there are multiple ways to skin this cat, then you can't say anything is correct. It's just the most optimal. It's the best. It's the one that we're going to go with, whatever you want to say. And so the ESTJs and ENTJs, they get sort of bogged down with, this is the correct way of doing it. And to them, they see it as, this is objectively true, right? This is objectively the best way of doing it. And I've proven it over and over again because I've shown how much money or time I save or resources or whatever, right? Fine. But it doesn't make it objectively true. It just makes it the best optimal solution. And trying to convince somebody who's an ESTJ or an ENTJ of that distinction is probably not worth your time. But for those of you who are introverted thinkers, my INTPs, ENTPs out there, you know what I'm saying, right? You know what I'm saying. The ENTJs, ESTJs are probably like, what are you mean it's not correct? What do you mean it's not the best solution? It's just that it's not necessarily true. It's not necessarily correct. Okay. So you get in these weird sort of, not really arguments, but just sort of a difference of viewing the world the TI users and TE users have, where the TE users, again, they're driven by this FI criteria. Here are the criteria that I have, and here's the best solution that satisfies the most criteria. Where TI is more about, really finding like the objective truth, the valid outcome. And I see it in the workplace all the time. That's usually the first thing I can kind of distinguish is whether somebody's a TE user or a TI user, because the TE users are very obsessed or focused on process. I call them the process junkies. Like they have a process. They want to, get from point A to point B to point C, and they want as little friction in there as possible. Like they've got it figured out, or it's just the way that they've always been doing it. And the TI users come in and start, monkeying around with things and say, well, you can't really do it that way, because of code section, blah, 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 blah. And then there's code section, blah, 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 blah. And they're doing this like TI puzzle solving. And they're not really focusing so much on efficiency and getting past the goal line, so to speak. They're more focused on, is this a valid way of doing it? Can you really do it this way? And so you have to find that balance, right? You have to have enough TI to understand, okay, I can't just do things, the way I want them all the time, because there are some rules out there. But the TI users have to understand, okay, yeah, there's that rule, but, there are exceptions to rules, and are you real, does it really apply here, and blah, 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 blah. And it's just sort of more practical to do it this way, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the way everybody else does it, so why don't we do it that way? That's another reason that TE can get confused with objectivity, is because a lot of TE problem solving is, well, this is just the way everybody else does it, right? This is the way that 90% of the industry or the market does it, so we're going to do it this way. Why reinvent the wheel? So, sort of thing. And again, they're confusing. If somebody comes and says that that's an objective solution, 90% of the world does it this way, or 99% of the world does it this way, that's not objectively true. It's just a consensus, right? It's just because everybody else agrees, hey, this is the best way or the most optimal or the cheapest way to do it, doesn't necessarily make it true. It's not a logically valid conclusion, okay? It's just a consensus. It's just that everybody out there sort of agreed, okay, this is the best way to do it for now, until some other technology or way about going about it comes out and then just sort of disrupts the industry, and then everybody has to do it a different way, okay? And that's how you know that it's not objectively true, is, somebody else can invent some new software or some new way of doing things and then blow up the industry, and everybody has to readjust. And now, 90% of the people did it this way last week, and now 90% of the people are going to have to do it a totally different way because we have this new technology, blah, 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 right? That's TE stuff. That's process stuff. That's getting from point A to point B, getting some sort of problem solved in the real world. TI stuff is that logic stuff. And again, you see the TI users battling with FI type questions, right? Because to me, the distinction is really between TI and FI, not so much TI and TE. The real distinction is between TI and FI. And are you making a subjective conclusion, or are you making an objective conclusion? And is it necessarily the case, or is it just it ought to be the case, or it should be the case? That's FI stuff. And so when people with lead TI or front stack TI are presented with FI type questions, you'll see them try to answer it in a TI way. And the best example that I can think of to illustrate this is the Zendaya videos that I always talk about. You know, if you haven't seen them, go watch the videos on my channel with Zendaya answering these, you know, the Proust questionnaire, which is basically a bunch of FI questions. Like, what, you know, do you value this? You know, what's your favorite this? You know, tell me about a time where this, you know, you experienced this, you know, very FI type questions. You know, watch it and you'll get what I'm talking about. And I make the argument that she's FI polar. She's probably an ESTP in my view, because she has such difficulty answering these questions. And I think a lot of it is that she's trying to come up with a correct answer. Like they're asking her this question, and most of her answers are sort of like the type of answer that most people would see as an objectively good answer, right? Like, what do you like to spend time doing? I like to spend time with my family, right? Like nobody's going to disagree that spending time with your family is a good answer to that question. And so a lot of times, you know, and there's definitely some FE part in that, but I also think there's this TI part where they want it to be correct. They want everybody to agree that that is a good answer, or that, you know, my answer is not incorrect. Nobody's going to come and tell me that I'm wrong, right? That, you know, I like to spend time with my family. But it gets difficult for her because it's sort of, I think, those questions were sort of prodding into things that she couldn't really think of, like, oh, what's a good answer that everybody is going to agree to, because it was very subjective, right? And you compare her to people who I would argue are, you know, have lead FI or FI in their front stack. They have no problem answering these questions, you know, because it's coming from an FI place. It's coming from an FI decision making, where TI users are, again, trying to find the right answer that can't be proven wrong, rather than just giving the answer that, you know, they feel, you know, answers the question for them. And then there's also a video with me and Shane Starr, who has FI third function. He's an ISTJ, and so and then, you know, I have TI as a front stack function, and you could see, just comparing the two of us, the difference, where it just takes me longer. I got to think about it more. I got to put a little bit more attention, a little bit more resource into trying to come up with an answer. And not only that, but just internally, what you know, when I was going through this process, I really did feel like, okay, I got to come up with an answer that I can justify, that I can explain, that is objectively true, right? That, you know, nobody's be able to argue against me. Where I get the sense from Shane that, you know, this is just the answer. You know, this is just how he feels, and if somebody feels differently, fine, right? You know, and he's not worried about it being objectively true or not, in the same way that a TI user might. So I think that's why thinking about subjective versus objective makes things easier to sort of put these puzzle pieces together to see a clearer picture when thinking about the cognitive functions. Because if you think of TE as being objective, you're just going to go down the wrong path, right? Because every TE problem that needs a TE solution, there's probably 50 different solutions that somebody can give you, you know, maybe even an infinite number of solutions, some completely unreasonable, but they're still solutions, right? Like, it would be completely unreasonable for me to stop off at the airport as I'm driving to work, to stop off at the airport, drive to Shanghai, then fly to Shanghai, fly to Paris, and then fly back. That is unreasonable, but it's still a solution to a TE problem, right? I still get from point A to point B, but it's clearly inefficient. It's clearly expensive. It clearly requires way more resources than is necessary to solve the problem, but it solves the problem, right? as opposed to TI type stuff where there's really only one way and one valid conclusion to come up with. And there might be very few things in this world that you can really use TI in that way. And I would argue most decisions that we make are FI decisions. They're more sort of, this is what I prefer, or this is what, I've got this criteria, and this satisfies my criteria the most, right? But we like to convince ourselves that we're being logical and that it's necessary. It's a necessarily correct answer, but it's not completely. It's not logically true or logically necessary. So, all right, I think I've gone on long enough. But again, it's an interesting topic. I think it's very important to know in order to understand the difference between TI and FI. Again, TI is looking for that correctness. FI is looking for that, does it satisfy my criteria? And then all the puzzle pieces of whether you're a TI user or a TE user really start falling into place, and making it a lot easier to figure out what all these different types are doing. Okay, cool. See you next time. Have a good one.